Here we go again, yet another instance of two of our adversaries meeting in alliance. President Ebrahim Raisi of Iran meets with Xi Jinping of China in Beijing to strengthen Iranian-Chinese relations. Our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, seems to have very little concern for the disastrous 50-car train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio last week. The Queen Consort of Britain, Camilla, will not be allowed to wear a precious 105-carat jewel to her husband, King Charles III's coronation ceremony. We're going to discuss why that is and the history behind that precious metal. And finally, because this month marks 99 years since President Woodrow Wilson's death, I examine how one critical part of his presidency laid the groundwork for the big government leftism that we see everywhere today. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey friends, it is Thursday, February 16th, 2023. I hope that you are having a great week. And yes, I am still sporting the color red in honor of Valentine's Day 2 days ago. Let's just call it Valentine's month. And I'm certainly eating candy as well to stay in the holiday mode. I'd like to remind you all to please like, subscribe, and comment on this channel. You can also follow me on Instagram at Julie R. Hartman. And also, please email me at julie@julie-hartman.com. I mentioned this yesterday, but I want to do a Q&A segment on this show, and I've already gotten some submissions from some of you who listen, and so I encourage the others of you to please write in to me, and you can put in the subject line Q&A or a question for Julie or whatever you would like to put in the subject line. But the point is, I will read your questions on air and I will answer them, and they can be about anything. They don't necessarily have to pertain to politics or history. But now, moving on to politics and history. Yesterday, Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing to discuss 20 cooperation agreements that they ended up signing. This is according to China's state-run media, Xinhua News. President Raisi of Iran said of this meeting, quote, "Old friends are the best partners for future cooperation." We should all get the chills at that statement because it is not a good thing that these two big adversaries of ours are meeting and becoming closer together. China has pledged to help Iran, among other things, build up its nuclear weapon arsenal. Now, some of you may know that back in about 2015, I think it was, Sean can fact check me on that, the United States and China were two of the world powers that signed the Iran nuclear deal. This was under President Obama, that helped to strengthen Iran's nuclear arsenal. But then in 2018, under President Trump, he pulled the United States out of that agreement, saying, why does Iran need nuclear weapons? This is a country that sells drones to Russia. I've been reporting on this week how they are sending another 6,000 drones to Russia in order to help it in the war effort against Ukraine. They have also, it was in 2015, Sean? Yes, okay, I was right. Also, they are setting up a weapons factory in Tajikistan, again, to help the Russians prevail over Ukraine. Iran also, again, among many other things, sends weapons to the Hezbollah, which is a Shia terrorist organization in Lebanon that fires rockets and sends infiltrators into Israel. And also, the Iranian regime is perhaps one of the most sadistic, brutal, and misogynistic on the face of the earth. I have reported many times on this program about how the Ayatollahs constantly persecute women, specifically in the country. Some of the unbelievably evil policies include that marital rape is legal. The age of criminal responsibility in Iran is 15 years old for men, and it's much younger, about 10 years old for women. Women cannot attain certain educational degrees or work in certain professions without the approval of her husband, father, or brother. It is just sadistic country. And so President Trump was right to say, why are we giving them weapons? Well, China has re-entered into that agreement in this latest meeting. China has also promised to import more agricultural products to Iran. And in turn, Iran has promised to keep importing Chinese oil. Now, Iran relies heavily on Chinese oil imports. They get about 1.2 million barrels of oil a day. This is according to latest numbers in December of 2022. And by the way, that number is up from 130% last year. So these countries have only grown closer together. And another key component of this meeting is that China agreed to work with Iran more on its Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative is where China goes into these various countries all around the world and initiates infrastructure projects in order to industrialize that country. But really what it does is China creates a situation where they have control over certain aspects of that country's economic sector and also over their politics. Because if China is giving a lot of aid to countries, then leaders of those countries are not going to be very likely to speak out against China. And we saw this on full display just about a week ago when the second Chinese spy balloon traversed over Latin America. And I reported on this show that the Colombian president said that they weren't really worried about the spy balloon. It did not pose a national security threat. And he dutifully repeated the Chinese's assertion that it was just a weather balloon or a civilian research balloon that had floated off course. And then if you look at behind the scenes, if you look at Colombia's relationship with China, you understand why the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, bit his tongue. It's because China is now building a railway line in Bogota, the capital of Colombia. And back to this agreement with Iran, they are doing a similar thing in Tehran. Iran hopes to sign a $12 billion transportation contract that would include China building a high-speed rail link between Tehran and the northern Iranian city of Masad. And also, China has already agreed to develop Iran's biggest airport in the capital of Tehran. This is the Imam Khomeini International Airport. All of this is according to Iran's state-run news agency. Now, this is not the first time in recent weeks that China has met with a principal adversary of ours. Just about 2 weeks ago, China met with Vladimir Putin and strengthened ties between the two countries. Also, back in January, Chinese President Xi Jinping traveled to Saudi Arabia, where he met with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and they initiated several strategic partnership agreements, as they called them, including hydrogen energy development in Saudi Arabia and bringing Huawei, which is the Chinese tech corporation that has been banned in the United States because, like so many other Chinese technological devices, they use it to spy on citizens. But Huawei is now being brought to Saudi Arabia, and all of these cell phone towers are going to be built in Saudi cities. So I unfortunately anticipate that I will be reporting much more in the coming weeks on other places that Xi Jinping will travel to further cement these strategic partnership agreements with our adversaries. But for now, even looking at this running list, this is enough, again, to make us all pause and fret. Now, moving on to domestic news. Some of you may not know this because the mainstream media, according to the Daily Wire, has only spent about 30 minutes in total reporting on this disastrous event. Of course, I'm referring to this February 3rd train crash in Norfolk. It's a Norfolk Southern train, I should say. It's where 50 train cars of a Norfolk Southern train station went off track in East Palestine, Ohio, causing a days-long fire in the area. 10 of these 50 derailed cars had hazardous chemicals on them that, of course, leaked and spilled. And these included combustible liquids that could potentially set off a major explosion, and also chemicals that have long-term respiratory and migraine consequences and issues for those who are affected. The town of East Palestine was evacuated for several days after this incident last week, but people have returned back to the town now that that evacuation order has been lifted. But unfortunately, and sadly, unsurprisingly, many citizens are reporting that they are falling ill, that they have stinging in their eyes, that there's a lingering smell in the area, a putrid stench, and that their pets are falling ill as well. Even the Democrat from Minnesota, Representative Ilhan Omar, who does not like to criticize fellow Democrats, spoke out about this incident and called out specifically our Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who clearly has done an incredible job in his position. It seems like almost every day we hear about a new incident, whether it's at American airports or train derailments. And Representative Omar tweeted, quote, that this derailment will have a significant negative impact on the health and well-being of residents for decades. We need congressional inquiry, she said, and direct action from Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg to address this tragedy. Mr. Buttigieg, or I should call him Secretary Buttigieg, at a symposium in Washington recently did not acknowledge this disastrous train derailment, and instead he seemed to joke about other transportation woes that have afflicted this country in recent weeks. Let's listen to the clip.
We've faced issues from container shipping to airline cancellations. Now we got balloons.
You see the smug smile on his face, like he's just saying, oh my gosh, what a crazy gamut of things. Secretary Buttigieg, you are responsible for making sure that our transportation runs smoothly. So really, he should be taking this much more seriously than he has. Also, we know that yesterday in Tucson, Arizona, another bad leak occurred, this time on a freeway that runs through Tucson. A truck tractor pulling a box trailer containing liquid nitric acid got into a fatal crash, causing those chemicals to leak. Now, in a similar situation to East Palestine, the acid that leaked as a result of this crash sent up a yellow and red plume. It also created this putrid smell and caused a lot of people in the area to fall sick. Again, there was an evacuation order for people within 3 miles of this crash, but the effects will linger for decades. Hopefully not, but it seems so. In our final news story of the day, King Charles III's coronation is coming up in just a few months. It is slated to happen this May, and there will be something missing from that ceremony. And no, I am not talking about Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle and their 2 children, though of course it is dubious as to whether or not they will attend the ceremony. But instead, I am talking about one of history's most celebrated diamonds. That is how the New York Times characterized this jewel. It is called the Koh-i-Noor. It is a gorgeous, dazzling Indian jewel. It's a diamond that is 105 carats, one of the largest in the world, 1.5 inches long by 1.5 inches wide. And it is currently kept along with other precious jewels in the Tower of London. The backstory here is that in the 1840s, this diamond was taken from an 11-year-old Indian prince, and it was given to Queen Victoria. Since then, it has been used and worn by various monarchs, most notably Queen Elizabeth I, who wore it to her 1937 coronation as the Queen Consort to King George VI. Queen Elizabeth I, of course, is known as the Queen Mother. And our most recent queen, Elizabeth II, who passed away back in September, wore it to her coronation in 1953. The Indian government in recent years has expressed some anger about the British possession of this jewel. And a spokesperson a few weeks ago for Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India told the Daily Telegraph that, quote, the coronation of Camilla and the use of the crown jewel Koh-i-Noor brings back painful memories of our colonial past. And they respectfully requested that the British not allow the Queen Consort Camilla to wear this to the coronation, and Buckingham Palace acquiesced to this request. They have announced that Camilla will not be wearing the precious jewel. Instead, she will be wearing a crown that belonged to Queen Mary, who is Queen Elizabeth II's grandmother, the Queen Consort who served from 1910 to 1936. Now, India recently overtook Britain as the world's fifth largest economy. The first one, at least for now, is the United States. Number 2 is China. Number 3 is Japan. Number 4 is Germany. And number 5 used to be Britain, but now it is India. So some Brits are viewing this concession of this jewel as sort of bad timing, alongside other news that India is surpassing Britain economically. Now, finally, for our timeless topic of the day, I'd like to talk to you about President Woodrow Wilson. Now, you may be thinking this is a little bit random for a Thursday in February, but it is actually not, because this month marks 99 years since President Wilson died. And I have been doing a lot of reading on United States presidents, and specifically Woodrow Wilson, because he is one of the progenitors of this big government system that has taken over the United States today. It always fascinates me to think about the origins of our political situation now, how the government has become so large and expansive, how wokeism has infiltrated into nearly every institution, and a lot of it can be traced back to Woodrow Wilson. Now, of course, it's not fair to blame one person for all of our woes today. And I'm certainly not trying to imply that President Wilson didn't do some good things while he was president. For instance, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was passed under his presidency in 1920. But still, some of his decisions as president opened the door for later abuses of power that have unfortunately become commonplace today. Now, everyone thinks that FDR was the first big government progressive president, but it was actually Woodrow Wilson. To give a little bit background on President Wilson, he was the son of a minister. He went to Princeton University, so he was a member of the American elite. He also got a law degree and a PhD, so again, he was quite academically credentialed. He went on to become the president of Princeton University, as well as the government of New Jersey as a Democrat. And then, of course, he became the president of the United States. Wilson was the first president to embody this morally superior, overwhelmingly left-wing idea, that we don't need limited government, or that we really don't need to pay attention to the Constitution. Wilson, prior to his presidency, wrote several books on his political philosophies. And in one of them, he argued that the separation of powers was outdated. Now, I have reported on this show about several instances around the world of governments scrambling and engaging in a lot of strife because they don't have as clear and as good of a system as we have with our separation of powers. One of the countries that has most recently been in the news because of this is Israel, where some on the right believe that Israel's Supreme Court exercises too much power. They have this standard called the reasonableness standard, where the Supreme Court can reject a statute if they think they have a reasonable reason, for lack of a better word, to do so. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has proposed several judicial reforms. One of them is where the Knesset, which is the Israeli Congress, with a simple majority, 61-person vote, can overturn a ruling by the Supreme Court. And whichever side you fall on doesn't really matter for the sake of this conversation. What does matter is that Israel is in this situation, A, because they don't have a written constitution, and B, relatedly, because they don't have anything that spells out the proper role of the executive, legislative, and judicial branch that we in the United States have. We so often take these guardrails, these things that we have in place to prevent tyrannical behavior, we take so much of that for granted, and Woodrow Wilson, even 100 years ago, took it for granted as well. He also wrote that as history has progressed, humans have also progressed for the better, and he says that we don't need checks anymore on federal power as people become more moral and kind. Now, of course, President Wilson died before World War II occurred, but he should have known better. He was president during World War I. He knows human nature is not good. It was a pretty naive thing to argue and to think. Wilson also criticized the Constitution, and he said that its meaning should be stretched and interpreted based on the needs of today. He famously wrote, quote, "The Constitution was not made to fit us like a straitjacket." So really here in the early 20th century, we start to see a fissure between liberals and conservatives, where conservatives really start to become the cohort that wants to conserve the principles of the American founding, to have an originalist interpretation of the Constitution. And believe it or not, people who we call liberals used to have a similar view. But again, here is where that kind of split. And liberals more so became the political cohort that says, no, we don't need these documents. We don't need these guardrails. We can reimagine the way things work in the United States. And in my view, this epitomizes the idea of, I know better. I am better, wiser, and smarter than the founding fathers, and I don't need to be beholden to any constraints that they put on me. And we can see today that as good as it may sound in theory, stretching the Constitution beyond its original meaning sets a very dangerous precedent for people in power. So Wilson was, again, one of the first presidents who really just made the presidency what he wanted it to be. He thought that the president, as the only official elected by the entirety of the United States, the whole people, should not just be head of the executive branch, but head of the whole government. He also thought that the administration should have experts and bureaucrats that make decisions. So in that sense, Wilson was the founder of the deep or administrative state that we see everywhere today. He also established the federal income tax and the Federal Reserve, which aren't necessarily bad things, but it is true that it did expand our role of government and the government reach. And these policies opened the door for presidents like FDR and LBJ, the former of which created these alphabet soup of acronyms of government agencies, the EPA, the CCC, the AAA. And now, today, we see that all of these sort of fourth heads of government exist in every realm of our society. These are unelected leaders who are appointed or anointed by legislators or by governors, and they make decisions that affect the rest of us. One of the most recent examples here in this state of California is the Reparations Task Force in Sacramento, who has voted to give Black people in the state hundreds of thousands of dollars in reparations. Now, I have lived in California for my entire life. I have never even heard the names of any of those individuals on the task force. I certainly never voted them into power or agreed to give them the right to do this. But instead, again, a group of Democrats decided to appoint this committee to decide how the rest of us should live our lives. And a similar example coming out of California, there are these group of doctors that Gavin Newsom tried to anoint to say that certain other physicians who spread COVID misinformation could have their medical licenses removed pending review by those Newsom anointed group of doctors. Thankfully, a federal judge struck down that bill that Gavin Newsom was trying to pass. But again, yet another example of unelected, bureaucratic, quote unquote, experts, this fourth head of government that was set up originally by President Woodrow Wilson. Now, the biggest concrete example of Wilson's arrogant idea that he was above the Constitution, that he knew better than everyone else, was how he handled World War I. He did terrible things during this war. The first of which is that he interned German Americans. Now, it is very famous that under President Roosevelt in World War II, he interned Japanese Americans. But this internment of foreigners didn't start with FDR. Again, it started under Wilson in World War I. Wilson also passed the Sedition Act, which prevented anti-war speech. But what he really mismanaged was the peace negotiations. So why did Woodrow Wilson take us into World War I in the first place? It was not, as I thought, to help our allies, Britain and France, against Germany, but rather, Wilson had grand visions for a new world order. In fact, he told Congress shortly before entering the war that he wanted to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, and, quote, be the champion of the rights of mankind. So all of this sounds great. Who wouldn't want to make the world safe for democracy and champion rights of mankind? And it seems like Wilson's entrance into World War I was selfless, and I'm sure that there were some good intentions behind it. I don't think it's fair to paint any leader, good or bad, with a broad brush and say that they were 100% a hero or 100% a villain. But here's why this entry into World War I was actually not as pure as we may think it is. Wilson's primary motivation, again, was to create a new world order based on his idea of how he thought the world should work. And the thing that he wanted most, this was his baby, was to establish a League of Nations. The League of Nations was essentially a precursor to the United Nations. It's this international body of members. And Wilson knew that the fastest way to get this League of Nations done was to enter a war and to push it forward in the peace negotiations. So Wilson does just that. He enters World War I. He allows a swift victory to happen in Europe. Some estimates say that our American intervention saved 1 million lives in the war. And then he immediately drew up plans for peace. And as part of those plans for peace, he promises Germany that if it surrenders completely, this is at the end of the war, that he would ensure in the peace negotiations that Germany got a fair and not punitive peace settlement. So Germany says, deal. That sounds great to us. It lays down its arms, and Wilson is seen as a hero. But what Germany did not anticipate is that after it surrendered, Wilson then went with Germany's adversaries, the British and the French, and brokered a new deal that in exchange for Britain and France's agreement to Wilson's beloved League of Nations, Britain and France could basically punish Germany however they wanted because they hated Germany. So Wilson agreed here, and again, Wilson in the United States were sort of the party that was governing the peace negotiations. They really called the shots. Wilson agreed to the Treaty of Versailles' infamous war guilt clause. This is Article 231, which said that all people of German nationality were collectively guilty for all of the deaths and all of the property damages during the war. Wilson, crucially, also agreed to make Germany pay the Allies billions of dollars in reparations that were so severe that they decimated Germany's economy, opened the door for the rise of Hitler, and ready for this, they were so costly that Germany only finished paying them in 2010. So it was Wilson who permitted the British and the French to impose these terrible measures so that he could get from them what he wanted, the League of Nations. But he just totally screwed Germany because, again, he told Germany that he would protect them and he left them out to dry. Wilson seemed to forget, though, because he didn't care at all about the separation of powers, that the United States Constitution requires the president to get the Senate's approval for any war treaties. And the Senate, rightfully so, had concerns about the League of Nations, specifically about a provision, Article 19, that would have required the United States to intervene militarily if any other member of the League was attacked. So the Senate said, wait a minute. That's taking away our constitutional authority to make that decision. We don't want that. There were many other people outside of the Senate, such as John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, who told Wilson that the way that he was going about these peace negotiations was really bad, that allowing reparations to be imposed on Germany to the extent that they were was ill-advised. And the Senate gave Wilson many opportunities to amend the treaty, but Wilson dug his heels in and he said, no, I want the treaty to be passed exactly the way I want it. So the Senate ended up rejecting it, and the United States did not even enter the League of Nations that Wilson himself designed. The moral of the story here, the important lesson that I would like you to take away, again, is that Wilson embodied this destructive left-wing idea that the leader is above the system, that he can remake the system according to his will. And we see how it worked out for President Wilson by creating yet another world war 2 decades later. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed this. And again, as a reminder, please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Follow me on Instagram at Julie R. Hartman, and email me with any of your questions about anything under the sun at julie@hartman.com. And also remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Take care.